There was someone in the room, someone who shouldn't be there, someone who had been dead for 3 days, and he was looking at him, head on, unable to look away, unable to breathe, because that man standing in front of him, the one he had seen suffer until the very end, was his older brother. And he had seen him be born. He had seen him grow up. They had slept under the same roof, eaten at the same table, worked with the same hands. And during all those years, he never believed in him. There is something that paralyzes a man when he discovers that what blinded him the most in life was exactly what accompanied him the most. This is the story of James, the brother of the Son of God, the man who knew him better than anyone in the world and took longer than anyone to truly see him. 2,000 years ago, and his story still hurts. If stories like this move you, subscribe. Every week we bring you a life that changed history. Nazareth, a small village in northern Galilee. Dust in the streets, the smell of freshly cut wood at dawn, the sound of a mallet hitting a beam before the sun even finished rising. In this place, everyone knows who you are, where you come from, and what your parents did. And in this village, in this carpenter's workshop, James grew up. His family was not ordinary. His mother Mary was a woman the neighbors described in a single word: upright. His father Joseph, a craftsman who taught his sons to work before they knew how to read. And there was an older brother, a brother who, since he was a child, asked questions no one knew how to answer. A brother who at 12 years old, when they lost him in Jerusalem during the Passover, was found in the temple debating with the teachers of the law as if he had been doing it his whole life. James heard that story. He heard it many times, and something inside him never knew what to do with it, because when you've known someone since they were born, when you remember that one day they spilled water on the table and your mother had to clean it up, it's very hard to listen when people say that man is something more than a man. You know him too well. And that, which should be an advantage, becomes a wall. Have you ever stopped listening to someone close to you because you thought you knew them too well to be surprised? Have you ever ignored a familiar voice because you thought you already knew everything they could tell you? James did, and he paid dearly for it. When Jesus was about 30 years old, he left the workshop. He left Nazareth and began something no one expected. The news started to arrive that he had cured a blind man, that he had multiplied bread before thousands of people, that crowds followed him through the desert regardless of hunger or heat. And James listened to all of this in the same workshop, with the same smell of wood on his hands. And he did not go. It wasn't fear. It was something harder to confess. The man everyone was talking about was the same one he had known as a child. The very same. And he knew things about him that the crowds didn't. In his mind, that was reason enough not to move. But there was something else, something James would have never dared to say out loud. When your older brother becomes the topic of conversation for an entire region, when his name fills the squares and empties the workshops, when people walk for whole days to see him, something stirs inside the one who stayed behind. Something that isn't exactly pride, nor exactly envy. It's more like the burden of someone who feels history left him in the wrong place without asking. And James carried that weight in silence. Year after year, with the mallet in his hand, with the wood shavings under his feet, with his brother's name arriving through every mouth except his own. And the worst part wasn't what he was ignoring. The worst part was what he was going to lose without knowing he was losing it. But what James didn't know yet was that this certainty he carried inside, that feeling that he knew him too well to be surprised, was the most dangerous voice he had ever heard. A year passed. 2. His brother's name was heard in every city. News arrived that he had resurrected a man in Bethany, that he had entered Jerusalem surrounded by palm branches and shouts, that the priests wanted him dead, and James was still in Nazareth with his certainties. There is something the sources leave open like a wound. It is likely that James was among the relatives who one day went looking for him and said of him out loud that he had lost his mind. And here the story gets difficult, because James wasn't a bad man. He was a man who used everything he knew to avoid seeing what was right in front of him. We have all done that at some point. And then came the Passover of the year 33, and Jesus was arrested and judged and condemned and taken outside the city, and his mother was left alone at the foot of the stake. While the sun darkened over Jerusalem, while the earth trembled beneath the feet of those who dared to stay. And James was not there. Not with the disciples, not with Mary, not with anyone. And that absence is the darkest weight of his entire story. Because there are moments that happen once, that time does not give back, that cannot be undone with any words. James knew this. But there was something he didn't know yet. Something that was going to happen in the next few hours. Something no man in history has been able to explain with words. Jerusalem. The city smelled of burned incense and something darker no one knew how to name. The body of Jesus had been taken down from the stake, wrapped in linen, taken to a borrowed tomb in the garden of a man who dared when no one else would. And the city moved on. That is what cities do. They move on. The 11 disciples were locked away, door bolted, fear clinging to their skin, the silence heavy as the stone that sealed the tomb. James was not with them. He had never been one of the 12, and now the only one who could have summoned him could no longer summon anyone. What does a man do when he discovers he was wrong about the most important thing in his life and can no longer say it? That is the question James carried that night. There is no record of where he was. The sources don't say. And that silence says more than any story. Maybe you know that feeling. When you realize you were wrong and the person you were wrong about is no longer there to hear you. Because James couldn't go with the disciples. He was a stranger to them. He couldn't comfort his mother. He had been part of the problem. He couldn't cry in public. No one would recognize him as someone who had just lost something. He was alone with something that has no exact name. The burden of having ignored someone who can no longer hear you ask for forgiveness. I knew him as a child. We slept under the same roof. We learned the same trade, and I never followed him. And now he is dead. And I was right. In everything I told myself for years, all the logic, all the prudence, everything I thought I knew about him, And now that logic has a name: cowardice, pride, blindness. I called him crazy, or at least I didn't say the ones who did were wrong. I left him alone, and I wasn't there. James's antagonist was never Rome. It was never the Sanhedrin. It was never fear. It was the voice every man carries inside when he confuses knowing someone with understanding them. And that voice had won for 30 years. But what James didn't know yet was that the story was not over, that something was going to happen that no logic could anticipate, and that it was going to happen specifically for him. The first day passed. The silence in Jerusalem was not the normal silence of mourning. It was the silence of something contained, of something that doesn't yet know if it has permission to happen. The second day passed, and time, that same time James had used for years to avoid deciding, was now working against him. A year ago, when Jesus healed the man born blind, James was in the workshop. He kept working. 2 years ago, when 5,000 people ate from what wasn't enough for 10, James was in Nazareth, with his certainties, with his logic, with his knowledge of who that man was. 3 years. Time is not a neutral background. Time collects its dues. And that week, in the cold streets of Jerusalem, time was collecting everything from him. And there was nothing to pay with. Where was his mother? With John, with the disciples, with those who had believed from the beginning. Not with James, a man who didn't go to his own brother's funeral, doesn't need anyone to explain what he feels. And the cruelest part of that weight was not the pain. It was the clarity. Because in that kind of loneliness, the mind does not get distracted. It does not protect itself. It does not invent excuses. It only shows. And what it showed was this: that James had had in front of him for 3 years the most extraordinary thing that had ever happened in the history of the world. And he had chosen to stay in the workshop. Not out of ordinary cowardice, but because of something harder to confess. Because believing would have cost him changing everything he thought he knew about himself. And that price, at that moment, had seemed too high. There are men who break at that point, when the weight becomes too much and they find no way out. James did not break, but he also didn't know what was coming. No one could know. Days passed. Maybe there is something you did once that you cannot undo. Someone you left alone in a moment that mattered, and you still carry it. James carried that for days. And then one day, the weight disappeared. There is no way to narrate what happened next without losing something in the attempt. The sources only say one thing. The resurrected Jesus appeared to James. Just that. No witnesses, without recording the place, no written words, only that it happened. Only that this man, whom he had seen die, was now standing in front of his brother. The same one who didn't believe, the same one who didn't go, the same one who perhaps said he had lost his mind, and he chose to appear before him. The Apostle Paul, years later, understood it, because he himself had lived it. The resurrected Jesus appearing specifically to the man who had followed him the least, not to judge him, to seek him out. What happened between the two brothers that day was not written down, but what happened next changed the rest of history. The same James who had not been in any upper room during the ministry was now in an upper room in Jerusalem, praying together with the apostles, with his mother, with his brothers, waiting for the day of Pentecost. He had crossed to the other side without making noise, without proclaiming it, without using his last name as a credential. And it wasn't long before everyone who arrived in Jerusalem knew one name as a central reference. Peter, miraculously freed from prison, gave these instructions to the gathered brothers. Report these things to James and to the brothers, not to the 12, to James. The one who took the longest to enter had become one of those holding the door. Years passed, and James became what the sources bluntly call a pillar. Not for his name, not for his blood, for his conduct. When the most explosive debate in the history of the movement reached Jerusalem, whether or not the Gentiles should be circumcised to belong to the people of God, the room was charged. There were men who had come from Antioch. There were converted Pharisees who wouldn't yield an inch. There were entire congregations waiting for the answer, like someone waiting for a sentence. Peter spoke, Paul spoke, Barnabas spoke, and the room fell silent. That silence wasn't empty. It was the silence of a room that knows the next voice is the one that ends the debate. And everyone looked at James, Cephas, and John, the ones who seemed to be pillars. And he spoke, not as the brother of Jesus, as the man who had spent 30 years without believing and knew better than anyone what it meant for the door to be open for everyone. His decision was adopted, his words sent to every congregation. And then came the year 62 of our era. The Roman governor had died. His successor had not yet arrived, and in that lawless interval, the high priest Ananias saw his opportunity. He convened the Sanhedrin. He called the brother of Jesus to trial, and he offered him what is always offered in that room, a way out. Deny your brother. Say you were wrong, that you followed him by mistake, that you no longer believe, and all this ends. And James listened to him, and in that moment, in the heavy air of that hall, something must have moved inside him. Because it wasn't the first time he was asked not to believe in his brother. For 30 years, he had done it without anyone asking him to. Without it costing anything, with all the comfort in the world. And now they were asking the same thing, and it cost everything. 30 years ago, not believing was easy. Now it was impossible, not because the situation had changed, but because he had seen his brother standing alive after having been dead for 3 days. There is no record of his last words before the Sanhedrin. The sources say he was executed, that he remained faithful, that he did not deny. But there is something that was written down, a letter, a few pages, his only words that survived until today. And the first sentence of that letter says something the world didn't expect. It does not say, James, a brother of the Lord Jesus Christ. It says, James, a slave of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ. A slave, not a brother. The man who had the most powerful credential in history chose not to use it. That choice, a quill on parchment, one word chosen over another, is all you need to know about what happened to James when he saw his brother standing in that room. That is how the story of James ended. And here is where your story crosses paths with that of James. Maybe it isn't a resurrected brother. Maybe it's a person you underestimated for years because you had always known them. Maybe it's a voice you ignored because it came from someone too close. Maybe it's a faith you kept at a distance because you thought you knew it too well to need it. Every time you decide to listen to someone you thought you had already heard, you are choosing to be like James. Every time you decide to let go of what you think you know and let the truth surprise you, you are choosing to be like James. Every time you decide to lower the guard of pride and admit that maybe you weren't entirely right, you are choosing to be like James. Every time you decide to write slave where the world would allow you to write important, you are choosing to be like James. And Jehovah knows that. Jehovah sees that effort without anyone asking you to, without anyone recognizing it, without the guarantee that they will see it in your lifetime. Take courage. Continue to be honest about what you do not know. Continue choosing the humility that no one can take from you. What part of James's story touched you the deepest? Leave it below. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to receive the next refreshing Bible story.
If you enjoyed this content, subscribe so you don't miss the next inspiring Bible story.